Isaiah eloquently compares the future rearrangement of the topography of Zion's hills to the rock-solid permanence of Yahweh's love for Israel.
For the mountains shall depart, and the hills be removed, but my kindness shall not depart from you, nor shall my covenant of peace be removed, says Yahweh, who has mercy on you. O you afflicted one, tossed with tempest and not comforted, behold, I will lay your stones with colorful gems, and lay your foundations with sapphires. I will make your pinnacles of rubies, your gates of crystal, and all your walls of precious stones.
For 2 millennia, Jews have been desperately trying to equate the suffering Messiah passages with Israel itself. Though Israel's affliction saves no one, the fact remains she is suffering. Here Yahweh promises relief and prosperity.
All your children shall be taught by Yahweh, and great shall be the peace of your children. In righteousness you shall be established. You shall be far from oppression, for you shall not fear, and from terror, for it shall not come near you. Isaiah 54:10-14.
If the Jews today think living under the threat of Islamic terror is bad, they're in for a shock. It will be far worse under the Antichrist during the second half of the tribulation. But life under Yahshua will bring absolute freedom from fear. The images Ezekiel's visionary temple presents are pictures of Yahweh's plan for mankind. We have already seen the reemergence of his 6+1 pattern and the outer and inner walls that signify that man must be born both physically and spiritually to enter the presence of Yahweh. The gates are the exclusive means Yahweh has provided to reach the throne of God. There's no climbing over the wall. The single door to the temple indicates that there is only one path to God, and you can't enter the temple without first going to the altar, for its massive form guards the only entrance. Once you're past the altar, however, and have entered the holy place, a picture of the state of being saved through the sacrifice of the blood of the perfect Lamb of God, then access to the very throne of God is provided via the altar of incense. This incense is representative of the prayers of the saints, which are as sweet and pleasant to Yahweh as the happy sounds of our children's greetings are to us. Of course, just as the incense of the tabernacle had to be made to a specific formula and used exclusively in the worship of Yahweh, only prayers in accordance with the will of Yahweh and offered to Him have a prayer of being answered in the affirmative. The bottom line, all these walls, gates, and altars are symbolic not of barriers to God's presence, but rather of the path He, in His loving wisdom, has provided for us. He wants us to approach Him, but He insists that we do it His way, in holiness. We'll discover more of Yahweh's plan as we proceed through Ezekiel's detailed description of the temple and its service. For now, let's pick up the narrative as he depicts the sacrificial altar standing immediately outside the entrance to the holy place.
These are the measurements of the altar. There is a gutter all around the altar, 21 inches wide and 21 inches deep, with a curb 9 inches wide around its edge. And this is the height of the altar. From the gutter, the altar rises 3.5 feet to a ledge that surrounds the altar. This lower ledge is 21 inches wide. From the lower ledge, the altar rises 7 feet to the upper ledge. This upper ledge is also 21 inches wide. The top of the altar, the hearth, rises still 7 feet higher, with a horn rising up from each of the 4 corners. The top of the altar is square, measuring 21 feet by 21 feet. The upper ledge also forms a square, measuring 24.5 feet on each side, with a 21-inch gutter and a 10.5-inch curb all around the edge. There are steps going up the east side of the altar. Ezekiel 43:13-17 NLT.
That's one big barbecue. The altar looms large, both figuratively and literally, in the doorway of the temple of God. Note that because the steps up to the altar are on the east side, one must face the temple, look Yahweh in the eye, so to speak, when approaching the altar. At this point, Ezekiel is given instructions for the inauguration of the temple.
Then he said to me, Son of man, this is what the sovereign Yahweh says. These will be the regulations for the burning of offerings and the sprinkling of blood when the altar is built. At that time, the Levitical priests of the family of Zadok, who minister before me, are to be given a young bull for a sin offering, says the sovereign Yahweh. You will take some of its blood and smear it on the four horns of the altar, the four corners of the upper ledge, and the curb that runs around that ledge. This will cleanse and make atonement for the altar. Then take the young bull for the sin offering and burn it at the appointed place outside the temple area.
That's on the first day. Notice that the priests don't provide the offering. The people do. The temple is for their benefit and the benefit of their children. The priests merely provide a service by presenting the offerings before Yahshua. They are the antithesis of an empowered and politicized clergy.
On the second day, sacrifice as a sin offering a young male goat that has no physical defects. Then cleanse and make atonement for the altar again, just as you did with the young bull. When you have finished the cleansing ceremony, offer another young bull that has no defects and a perfect ram from the flock. You are to present them to Yahweh, and the priests are to sprinkle salt on them and offer them as a burnt offering to Yahweh.
The use of salt in sacrificial offerings goes back to the law of Moses. Because salt is a preservative, it bears the symbolic meaning of permanence, suggesting an unbreakable covenant. It stands in contrast to leaven or yeast, which speaks of change and was never allowed on the altar.
Every day for 7 days, a male goat, a young bull, and a ram from the flock will be sacrificed as a sin offering. None of these animals may have physical defects of any kind. Do this each day for 7 days to cleanse and make atonement for the altar, thus setting it apart for holy use. On the 8th day, and on each day afterward, the priests will sacrifice on the altar the burnt offerings and peace offerings of the people. Then I will accept you, says the sovereign Yahweh. Ezekiel 43:18-27, NLT.
For 7 days, signifying completion, the ritual of dedication will continue, at which point the altar dedication will be complete. One way or another, all of these sacrifices point back to the finished work of Yahshua on the cross. The sin offering, for example, does not in itself atone for sin, but rather demonstrates the acknowledgement of the sinner that he needs forgiveness, and that this forgiveness is to be found in the sacrifice of Christ. Bear in mind that the earth is, as usual, populated with mortal men at this time, presumably not too far into the millennium. They have a sin nature, so just like you and me, they still sin, and then they either repent or they don't. This whole new sacrifice ritual is thus very much like the Levitical worship in the Old Testament, a multifaceted picture of the sacrifice of Yahshua that's designed to teach man in unmistakable terms about his need for redemption. But there is one important difference. Whereas the Levitical rituals were the exclusive province of the Jews, in the sense that the Gentile nations were not active participants, in the millennium, the whole world will be involved in the worship of Yahweh. The Jews will be the gatekeepers, so to speak. Zechariah explains.
Thus says Yahweh of hosts, Peoples shall yet come, inhabitants of many cities. The inhabitants of one city shall go to another, saying, Let us continue to go and pray before Yahweh, and seek Yahweh of hosts. I myself will go also. Yes, many peoples and strong nations will come to seek Yahweh of hosts in Jerusalem, and to pray before Yahweh. Thus says Yahweh of hosts, In those days 10 men from every language of the nations shall grasp the sleeve of a Jewish man, saying, Let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. Zechariah 9:20-22.
Needless to say, that's not what happens in our world today. Today the nations are repelled by the twisted caricature of godliness that Judaism presents. It's painfully obvious that God is not with them yet, for they have not yet returned to Him. This new relationship is referred to in another of Zechariah's prophecies as well.
Sing and rejoice, O daughter of Zion, for behold, I am coming, and I will dwell in your midst, says Yahweh. Many nations shall be joined to Yahweh in that day, and they shall become my people, and I will dwell in your midst. Then you will know that Yahweh of hosts has sent me to you, and Yahweh will take possession of Judah as his inheritance in the Holy Land, and will again choose Jerusalem. Zechariah 2:10-12.
In this remarkable passage, Yahweh as Father, that is, the Shekinah, and Yahweh as Son, that is, Yahshua, are both seen side by side in the same context. The Messiah is depicted as a man whom Yahweh has sent to Israel, but a man who acts with the very power and authority of God because he is God. Look closely. Yahweh speaks in Yahshua's voice when he says, Yahweh has sent me. It should come as no surprise that such a man/king/God would attract many nations to himself, and that they should earnestly desire to be his people. So we see that although priests and Levites will always have their assigned roles, devout Gentiles will be welcome participants in the worship of Yahweh.
Also the sons of the foreigner who join themselves to Yahweh to serve him and to love the name of Yahweh, to be his servants, everyone who keeps from defiling the Sabbath and holds fast my covenant, even them I will bring to my holy mountain, and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. Yahweh Almighty, who gathers the outcasts of Israel, says, Yet I will gather to him others besides those who are gathered to him. Isaiah 56:6-8.
The others, of course, are the Gentile nations. They will be on an equal footing with the Jews as far as being joyful in Yahweh's house of prayer is concerned. And lest you jump to the hasty conclusion that the Mosaic law will be pressed into service as a basis for salvation, let me point out that keeping from defiling the Sabbath is no more or less than what was listed in the previous breath: to join oneself to Yahweh, to serve Him, and to love His name, Hebrew Shem, His position, honor, authority, and character, His whole identity. Why? Because in this context, the Sabbath is the millennium, the whole 1,000 years. That's not to say that the myth of Sunday worship replacing the Sabbath observance will be perpetuated any longer. Yahweh never abrogated the Torah. He never said, remember the first day of the week to keep it holy. Sunday was man's idea. We have seen how the Gentile nations will keep the Feast of Tabernacles during this time. Zechariah goes on to explain how Jerusalem will open her doors to them.
On that day even the harness bells of the horses will be inscribed with these words, Set apart as holy to Yahweh. And the cooking pots in the temple of Yahweh will be as sacred as the basins used beside the altar. In fact, every cooking pot in Jerusalem and Judah will be set apart as holy to Yahweh Almighty. All who come to worship will be free to use any of these pots to boil their sacrifices, and on that day there will no longer be traitors,
literally Canaanites,
in the temple of Yahweh Almighty. Zechariah 14:20-21, NLT.
Those who make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem will be totally dedicated to the true worship of Yahweh. Even the most mundane appurtenances of daily life will be considered sacred, set apart for Yahweh's honor. The result? The whole town will become one huge party, especially during the Feast of Tabernacles.